today is the first part of our discussion, and we will be looking at this entire issue from the point of view of idea of political. In fact, this discussion on this theme, what is politics, will be spread over 2-3 lectures, where I will be touching upon different dimensions of this politics, that is the birth of this idea of political, then expansion of this idea of political, and some of the problematization of this issue of political in recent years and recent decades, particularly rise of new discourses, that how they have started looking at this entire question of politics and the idea of political. But today essentially we will be looking at this question that how do you understand this politics. In fact, in discipline of political science, politics is perhaps the most important engagement, because the entire discipline revolves around this issue of politics, and there is not one perspective which is universally accepted as the perspective on politics. There are different approaches, there are different viewpoints, and there is also contestation and debate on this issue of politics. But one thing is very important here to remember, that this idea of politics or what sometimes also is referred as political, in fact is not something new, which the present modern generation or the modern period has witnessed, but this idea of political has been going on since time immemorial, particularly since ancient time. And that is why when we study classics in political thought, the idea behind this study is simply to look at some of the issues they engaged with, that how those engagements are important to as a guide, or one can say that give some ideas about the ethical dimension of society and human life. So therefore, this the entire issue of politics has been understood, has been debated, has been problematized, has been understood from time immemorial, be it the Greek thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, or for example the ancient Indian thinker like Kautilya and others. So therefore, one thing we should keep in mind, that this is not something a new enterprise. This is as old as perhaps human history. But at the same time, we should also recognize one fact, that this entire idea of politics has been undergoing changes with a time and a space. And in modern time, today we are confronting an altogether different situation, where politics with the advent of democracy has become inescapable in today's life, both in terms of the presence of all encompassing state institution, or for that matter this entire idea of expansion of this idea of political, where in fact no sphere of society remains untouched with this issue. And perhaps this slogan, which was coined by the feminists in 20th century, personal is political, that symbolizes that not even the private sphere has remained insulated from the sphere of this politics. So this is how this entire theme has been expanding, and the feminists, the environmentalists, particularly the green theory and many other discourses, we find this expansion is continuously taking place. The boundaries are being broken, and therefore new frontiers are being created, and we have to take into account all these issues when we discuss this idea of political and expansion of this idea of political. But at the same time, we should also remember that there are certain problem areas which have been flagged, that how this idea of politics is reaching a stage where some of the issues which are confronting us, which appear to be highly problematic, and therefore this entire problematization has also happened side by side, this expansion of this idea of political. And this is how perhaps we engage with postmodernism, communitarianism, and a number of issues, particularly with the neoliberalism and number of other discourses which have emerged in recent decades, which are setting new agenda, posing new problems, sensitizing us to the new challenges of our time. So, it is how we have to look at this theme in terms of its multifaceted dimension, and this is what I will be trying to do in course of 2-3 lectures, in fact 3 lectures which will be devoted on this idea of politics or idea of political, and from the point of view of this question, that what is politics. Now, one thing we should remember, that as the first part of our discussion today, which is basically devoted to the idea of political, one thing we should remember, that politics is an old time activity and vocation. As I mentioned, that it is as old perhaps as human history. The art and science of politics have developed side by side over the years. When I say the science of politics and art of politics, what I imply by that, art is something which is practiced and the science is something what is basically understood, theorized, or one can say that or systematically presented. So, therefore, the two dimensions, two sides of this issue, politics have been going on side by side, which in other words can also say the question of theory and practice of politics, and that has also generated a lot of debate, that how this theory and practice can coexist, how theory and practice can go together, or should we separate the two. And here in fact it acquires some ideological overtone, particularly between the liberals and the Marxists, and particularly the Marxian school of thought has been emphasizing from the very beginning the idea of praxis, where it tries to combine theory and practice. In fact, Marx is believed to have criticized the earlier philosophers when he made this statement that philosophers still now have only interpreted the world, but now the thing is to change it. And this was basically, this statement was suggestive of this fact that interpretation or understanding is not enough. We have to engage with the practice of politics through revolution, the kind of definition which this tradition, the Marxist tradition, gave to politics as revolution. So, therefore, this combination of theory and practice was perhaps a hallmark of this ideology, whereas liberalism on the other hand has, of course, is not a very homogeneous school of thought, homogeneous ideas. There are multiple traditions, there are multiple positions within the liberal tradition on issue of politics, but nonetheless one thing is very clear, that they sometimes make a distinction between theory and politics, theory and practice, and art and science of politics. And it is largely on account of this fact that what we find, that in 20th century, when these disciplinary boundaries started emerging in social science, and politics as a separate discipline also came into existence with the emergence of political science, that symbolized that new intellectual mood, that how the theory and practice have to be separated. Now, one thing we should remember, that a skill in analyzing politics is not same thing as a skill in practicing politics. Both have a different type of domain, both have a different type of framework, or one can say the zone of operation. For example, Madison, the famous American president, in fact who also authored that famous book, the Federalist Paper, was a brilliant political analyst, and that is borne out by his writings. But he is considered to be a mediocre president compared to the other presidents who succeeded him. Similarly, on the other hand, we have had Roosevelt, who is not believed, or who is not considered a very skilled political, who is not considered to be a very astute political analyst, but is believed to be a skilled political leader, and therefore two contrasts one can take from United States of America, and from every country in modern times we can have similar examples, that one can be one can excel in the art of politics, other can excel in the science of politics, and Madison and Roosevelt perhaps are the best examples. What basically I want to say, that a skilled artist sometimes does not always succeed in explaining why or how he or she does superbly the way perhaps they are doing. So, therefore, they sometimes fail to explain their own performance, because they perform like a very accomplished artist. They are great performers, but then they don't know the reason, or they don't have explanation for that performance. So the analysis part they are not in a position to supply. But sometimes what happens, though sometimes a skill in practicing politics goes hand in hand with a skill in political analysis. Those who practice it with full perfection, with full accomplishment, they also sometimes make attempt to analyze their skill or the performance part of their art. And here three examples come to my mind. Woodrow Wilson, another American president, a great analyst, a great statesman, but at the same time a great practitioner who combined both art and science. And similarly the Lenin, architect of Bolshevik revolution, the father of modern Soviet Union before disintegration. And for example, from India one can take the example of Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, who also wrote, who reflected, who analyzed not only his own performance, but also the larger issues of politics. So this is how we can see examples of both types, where the theory and practice basically are completely divergent to each other. At the same time, some other examples where we can see also convergence. So what happened, that politics is therefore we can look at as both common activity indulged by people and a specialized activity by experts. In fact, both things happen side by side, and sometimes there is attempt to combine the two. Now of course, with the advent of democracy as a common activity indulged by people, with a new discourse on the sovereignty, that who is sovereign in democracy, neither God nor king. It is ultimately sovereignty is broken into multiple parts, and every individual is sovereign, and it is a collection of that individual sovereignty which basically gets telescoped into this entire idea of modern nation state, or one can say the political community. That is how the modern democratic order is perceived. So therefore, in fact, the common activity is of course a very important dimension of modern life, so far as politics is concerned. But then politics also suffers from the discourse on politics suffers from an irony. Irony is that on the one hand it is inescapable of in today's life. No one can say that he or she is basically untouched by politics in society, particularly after the advent of democracy. But on the other hand, sometimes politics is also used in very pejorative terms. Sometimes people simply look down upon politics. In fact, if someone is being referred as a political person, if he or she is in bureaucracy, in administration, in academia, then perhaps that suggests that he or she is not neutral, he is not being fair, he is not being transparent, he is being partisan. So therefore, this is an irony. On the one hand, it is such an important enterprise which touches human life. On the other hand, sometimes it is not seen in proper spirit. In fact, this apathy towards politics, particularly in the middle class in today's world, is another dimension, and it is best reflected during elections, with perhaps dwindling one can say the participation of people, when there is a very low turnout during elections. Even if elections play a very important role in modern democracy, so far as the political system is concerned, decision making is concerned, and the future of humanity is concerned, because they are decided, decisions are taken on basis of such mandates. But nonetheless, the turnout is pathetic. It is basically going down world over, and that is perhaps one thing which is suggestive of this fact, that this apathy towards politics, how it is basically getting reflected now through these electoral turnouts. So therefore, this is an ironical situation. On the one hand, politics is inescapable. On the other hand, that there is a gradual skepticism about the politics in society. Politics is considered to be an activity which should be indulged only by scoundrels, only by those who don't mean good things, only by those who don't care for society, and therefore sometimes people detest this activity. So this is something very disturbing trend. On the other hand, it is also there that sometimes public spirited people, people guided or driven by the desire to serve society, come to politics and they make it a mission in their life to serve the people. So, politics as a vocation. In fact, I am reminded of famous piece written by Max Weber, eminent modern political sociologist, who wrote a piece called Politics as Vocation and Politics as Science. So, therefore, in fact, this tells us that how he looked at the two issues, the activity and as practice, politics as vocation and politics as science. So, this is how we should look at this irony, that in spite of lot of people coming to this and taking it as a vocation to serve humanity, on the other hand there is also a skepticism. Now, of course, as I have already mentioned, the debate on combining theory and practice of politics, Marxist theory of praxis is often pitted against 20th century attempt to make theory of politics a science, particularly within broad liberal tradition. This entire attempt was made to make politics a scientific enterprise, and therefore it is not just a chance that this name, which was basically the way this entire study of politics was rechristened as political science, and some of the attempts, initial attempts were made in United States of America, and gradually it spread to different parts of the world, particularly aftermath of this behavioral revolution, when there was an attempt to make the study of politics scientific, and number of developments took place in political science, in social science at that time. Later on it was called political science. Birth of structural functional theory, system theory, behavioral theory as an overarching discourse, and number of attempts were made to study the behavioral patterns of people in society, the behavior of people in society, particularly the distribution of power in society, particularly electoral behavior. The purpose was to make predictions about human behavior with scientific precision, the way perhaps it is done in natural science, and that was the hallmark of this new intellectual mood at that time. And it was also pitted against this entire discourse of praxis, which was perhaps being basically talked about within another tradition, ideological tradition, that is Marxist theory, Marxist tradition, that how theory and politics can be combined. And here, in fact, I am reminded of that famous slogan coined by Mao Zedong in China after 1949 revolution, the communist revolution in China, when he gave this slogan that all scientists are workers and all workers are scientists. So, that was his slogan. It is a different matter that that slogan ran into trouble very soon, and he had to make modification, because he exempted the nuclear scientists from the purview of this slogan of all scientists are workers and all workers are scientists. But nonetheless, this theory of praxis basically was taken to the level of of practice, or one can say operation, by some of the post-revolutionary societies, including China. So, therefore, this debate on politics, the combination of theory and practice, has been going on from the very beginning, and it is here in modern period that we can find this debate getting very very live and very animated, because earlier in ancient, or for that matter even the formative years of the modern period, in fact this issue was not that much important, because politics was, ancient Greek thinkers study politics, as we will see later in our discussion today, that they had a very comprehensive understanding of society, where they did not split different spheres of life in multiple parts. In fact, ethics, politics, economy, even biology and other things were integrated in the larger understanding on study of society. This is how perhaps Plato looked at it, this is how Aristotle looked at it, this is how perhaps the ancient thinkers in India looked at it. Kautilya's Arthashastra is not just a discourse on economics, it is equally a powerful discourse on politics and administration. Similar examples can be picked up from different societies. Now, coming to modern time, even the formative period, we find that the scholars, the thinkers, didn't look at different aspects of social life in a fragmented way. In fact, politics was considered part of political economy. This is how perhaps Marx wrote, this is how perhaps John Stuart Mill wrote, this is perhaps how the Adam Smith wrote their pieces when they had a comprehensive understanding of politics and economy. So therefore, what we find that is fragmentation was not there. Only in 20th century these disciplinary boundaries, quest for disciplinary boundaries led to this fragmentation, and therefore this entire distancing of politics from other spheres of society, and with the additional baggage which politics carried was attempt to make it science. Of course, those who were clamoring for this scientific enterprise themselves realized their mistake, and later on, as it is remembered very often, that how David Easton, who was the architect of behavioral revolution, also initiated post behavioral revolution when he questioned some of the premises of behavioralism so far as its attempt to make it science was concerned. So therefore, this is something we should remember so far as this theory practice is concerned. In recent times, of course, as I mentioned, both have got separated, but earlier they coexisted in ancient time and also perhaps in modern times initially. Now, this evolution of political, that brings me to the question of the evolution of political, and here, as I was mentioning, that this entire issue of politics, the entire term politics is derived from the Greek word politikos and polis, and the French word for this is politique, and the Latin word is politicus, and and political in these usages essentially mean that really it's something which relates to citizens, affairs of state, and government or public policy formulation. So this is how this term politikos, the polis, the French word politique, these words are suggestive of citizens, affairs of state, the government or public policy formulation. It is of course used differently in different ideological and philosophical traditions. The usage changes in terms of its affiliation with a particular tradition, because later we will see that how there has been a contestation on this issue of politics, particularly ideological contestation, and particularly the major division is along two lines, the liberals and the Marxists. But among liberals, as I mentioned, that it is a very heterogeneous school of thought. There are number of positions. Some liberals simply look at it as a mechanism to resolve conflict and serve the common good, whereas some simply look at it as a mechanism to acquire power, and this is known as power view of politics. So therefore, in fact, there are multiple traditions within liberalism, whereas the Marxist tradition looks at politics essentially in terms of revolutionary politics of class struggle. For them, there is no scope for any mediation of conflicting interests that perhaps liberals make us believe. They would argue that the conflict is so fundamental, so structural, that conflict can be taken care of only by addressing the structural contradictions in society, and those structural contradictions are rooted in economic structure. Therefore, unless the structure is broken, unless economic structure is changed through politics, and only then perhaps the real liberation of society can happen. So therefore, it is altogether different take on politics so far as Marxist tradition is concerned. What I basically want to convey here, that it is used, the term politics may have come from the Greek word politikos or the polis, or the French word politique, or Latin word politicus. The Indian counterpart is of course Rajneet. Sometimes and there are different types of nitis which are discussed in Indian scriptures, and therefore we find different languages giving different type of words for this word politics, but at the same time we should also remember that they have been used differently in different ideological and philosophical traditions. Now, of course, analysis of political also has different connotations. It is not that only different traditions have made use of it, but it has different connotations, and here the 2-3 important connotations in modern time can be identified: the normative, empirical and behavioral. In fact, this normative and perhaps the empirical are not perhaps very new. In fact, even in ancient time we find these traditions existing in a different form, but the behavioral of course is a 20th century product, particularly after the behavioral revolution. Of course, we will be looking at these issues in some other part of discussion later, particularly different traditions of analysis, but these 3 important connotations are important to remember. Now, discipline to study political has been a matter of debate in modern times, and politics versus political science, as I was mentioning, is perhaps suggestive of that debate. Question on disciplinary boundary has basically marred this entire issue of engagement with politics in modern times. So, therefore, this politics versus political science issue in fact is quite quite well known in this debate on what is politics, and this is something which happened in 20th century and led to lot of heated exchanges between the 2 schools of thought, one which preferred the nomenclature politics, another which preferred the nomenclature political science. For example, a very famous institution in England, London School of Economics and Political Politics, decided to keep politics, not political science, whereas many universities in United States of America prefer the term political science, because ultimately this entire behavioral revolution was cradled in that country, and the Chicago school which basically heralded this new intellectual mood, that was perhaps the reason that United States of America became the epicenter of this entire discourse of making politics and a scientific enterprise. So, question of disciplinary boundary has been there, but that should not detain us any longer on this issue, and let us straight away move to this question that politics as a discipline and its evolution, that how it has evolved. And as I was mentioning, that earlier politics was not a separate branch of knowledge in ancient time, and continued even in modern time. For example, the ancient Greek philosophers like Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, they dealt with this issue as one of the aspect of the larger social life. Of course, politics was considered very important for them, as I will discuss later, that how Aristotle called human beings, man as a political animal, when he said man, because of course the Greek traditions had their own limitations when they didn't consider, didn't give equality to men and women, and also perhaps slaves and alien. So, therefore, when they talked of citizens, they essentially talked about men. So, therefore, Aristotle, when declared that man is a political animal and social animal, what he meant by this, that politics is such an important aspect of human life that no one can think or imagine a life without politics. Of course, that politics has a different connotation. The context was the city-state in ancient Greek Athens. City-state was like a village life, a small life, all inclusive, all encompassing life. So, therefore, politics was elevated to that level of a sphere which was perhaps governing a sphere so far as human life is concerned in society. Now, India, I am also mentioning Kautilya's Arthashastra, because here also the Arthashastra, the definition of Arth and Shastra, that is not purely economics, rather one can say the way political economy was imagined in modern time in Europe and other countries. Similarly, perhaps in India, this Arthashastra included both administration and discourse on politics. Not only Kautilya's Arthashastra, even Mahabharata, the Shanti Parv, is considered to be a great treatise on diplomacy and ethics, political ethics, and also some aspects of the larger political system and political issues. So, therefore, this is how we have seen we can see ancient Greek thinkers as well as ancient Indian thinkers. Even the Roman thinkers after the Greeks like Polybius and Cicero, and their writings perhaps also reflect the similar trend. In medieval period, St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, who mostly reflected on the relationship between church and state and religion and politics, they also had a very comprehensive, all encompassing take on politics, not something which was perhaps as fragmented as it was later done in 20th century. Modern period, as I mentioned, the initial phase of modern period, starting with Machiavelli, the Italian philosopher, Baudin, Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, the three important pioneers of the modern liberal theory, so to say, and later Hegel, Marx and many others who followed them, be it John Stuart Mill, Green or others. They also had a very all comprehensive account of politics. As I mentioned, that Marx and Mill both reflected on issue of politics and economy, both talked about political economy, not either politics or economics, because it didn't happen only in politics in 20th century, it also happened in economics. And the kind of disciplinary boundaries which were created didn't remain confined to political science, happened and spread to other branches of social sciences. With the birth of this microeconomics and other things, what happened that the boundaries of economics were also closed, and a particularly a very closed domain for economics was created. So therefore, the Hegel Marx Mill tradition, where that tradition was different, because they addressed the question of political economy, which had equal attention on both politics and economy. Now, the birth of democracy, what we find that the new meaning of word political started appearing on the horizon, and this is something important, because earlier, in fact, earlier period, till the time this expansion of political had not taken place, this entire idea of politics had a restrictive meaning. Initially it was confined to the king's court, it was basically confined to a society which was society of elites and not masses. So therefore, politics didn't include everyone. Be it ancient Greek period, as I mentioned, that their definition of citizenship was highly restrictive. Women, slaves, aliens were not given the citizenship in ancient Greek period in Athens. Similar was the situation in other countries, and this is here. It is here that we find that modern democracy, signals the advent of a new era, so far as this idea of political is concerned. And it is here we also find this expansion of this idea of political. A new meaning is altogether being attached to this idea of political. And along with democracy, birth of democracy in Western societies, initially in Europe, United States of America and many other countries, decolonization, particularly in 20th century. In Asia, Africa and Latin America, that also marked a new new imagination about this word political, because of course in Western societies idea of political was expanding with new voting rights. The entire franchise was being given, the women were getting enfranchised after suffrage movement, and working class was getting right to vote. But nonetheless, the non-Western societies of Asia, Africa and Latin America, who were still reeling under colonialism, they were denied this equality, equal political rights. But decolonization led to their independence, and then there was a reimagination, a new imagination on this entire issue of political. So one can say this expansion of this political domain, in terms of hemispheric frame, now it expanded all over the world, and therefore new connotations were added to this idea of political. And here perhaps some of these colonies played important role with their anti-colonial movement, and very powerful take on politics, on society, on state institutions, on future of humanity, on the meaning and notion of freedom. And it is here one cannot ignore the contributions of many thinkers of third world countries, including Gandhi in India and many others in other parts of the world. So therefore, this is how we can see that new imagination is happening on this idea of political, and we will be looking at these new imaginations when we will come to the next part in our discussion on this, what is politics, that is particularly the expansion of this idea of political. Now 20th and 21st century, of course new models of politics also emerged, and that is also something interesting. Some of these new models on the one hand led to expansion of this sphere of politics, on the other hand also gave new challenges, new questions were raised, be it globalization or the birth of NGOs as a model for politics in society, particularly civil society, the identity politics of multiple hues, be it the blacks, aboriginals, the castes, or one can say that a number of things. So therefore lesbians, gays, different types of rights movement and other things that symbolize a new model of politics in 21st century and also the end of 20th century. So therefore this expansion of boundaries started taking place, new imagination, or one can say politics got reimagined in a new form, and therefore we find that the modern period started on a different note, and we have reached to a altogether different stage. And when we discuss what is politics, we cannot ignore some of the questions which have been posed by them. Now with the evolution of evolution and changes in society, the art of politics has also changed, and accordingly the need to develop an understanding of it is also basically coming to us, because the art of politics has changed, because politics the way perhaps it was being done earlier, and a lot of things are contributing to it. In science one can say the information technology, this entire revolution in information technology and communication revolution have basically led to new features in politics, cyber politics one can say, biopolitics one can say, and number of issues are emerging, new questions are being raised, which were not thinkable or unheard of earlier earlier epochs. So therefore the new new questions on art of politics, that how this politics can be practiced in today's world, particularly with information and communication revolutions and other things, and therefore now debates are happening, particularly on issue of election, that whether with the new technology is it possible to imagine a situation where not on a fixed date and fixed time this voting should take place, rather it should be a continuous affair in human life, where one can simply put or cast their votes, and that votes would be basically lying in in a stock, and later on it can be calibrated. So all such things are emerging today, and today we are not in a position to say or pass any judgment with any sense of finality. So therefore what I am trying to say, that with these evolution and changes, the art of politics is also undergoing changes, and the need therefore to develop a new understanding about the new brand of politics is also emerging. And birth of social science and creation of the political disciplinary boundaries, political science as a subject, basically these issues are now not fixed the way they were there in 19th century and 20th century, but they have gone much beyond this. Now of course with this background, that how this politics as a discipline, how it has evolved, how this enterprise of politics is basically evolving, how this idea of political is getting expanded. Now let's before we come to this modern contestation on this politics, and where I will be looking at 3-4 important contestations, and then 3-4 new attempts to expand it, and then some of the new problematization of this. Before we come to that issue, let's have a look at this ancient Greek view on politics, which was all encompassing, as I mentioned earlier. Plato's book Republic and Aristotle's book Politics. These are two important tracts on this issue of politics. Now politics originated from Greek word polis, which I mentioned earlier, which meant essentially city estates, Athenian city estate. Life in city estate was very simple. It was a village type life, and this life village life, one can say, or a small scale life of human beings determined their understanding of politics when they considered politics and social affair to be basically enmeshed with each other. The Greek philosophers didn't make distinction between state and society, and this lack of distinction was on account of this fact that it was a very small scale society where basically there was participation of the people, or one can say citizens, a restrictive view of citizens in day to day affairs of state affairs, and norms like political, moral, personal and social, all these norms were included in politics. So when they talked of politics, that included all these things: moral, personal, social, and this is how perhaps Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Politics can be seen, because if you read it, then you find that it was not a pure discourse on politics, but everything, every aspect of society was basically was being discussed, debated and imagined. Now Aristotle, when called politics as a master science, he was basically referring to such situation, that politics, that is affairs of the state, are so important for human life that human life is unthinkable without referring to it, and therefore he called it master science, a governing science, a science which is integral part of human life. So therefore Greek thought begins with the social nature of human beings, and it is here as I mentioned that Aristotle said that man is a social animal, that he said that teleologically man may have been prior to society, but logically society is prior to man, and same statement for Aristotle applies to a state also, that teleologically a state may be prior to man, but logically logically a state is prior to man, teleologically man may be prior to the state. So therefore this is how state society distinction was blurred. This is how they considered integral part of human life. This is how Aristotle declared man as a social animal. Of course, many critics point out that that was a half statement. The man is social animal, but there are many aspects of man's life which do not allow them to live peacefully in society. They need some external regulation, which was perhaps addressed later in modern period by some of the thinkers, including Hobbes, particularly when looked at life and security as the prime concerns of human beings. We will take up this issue in course of our discussion. So therefore Aristotle, while declaring man as a social animal and blurring this distinction between state and society both in Aristotle and Plato, what we find that politics was not seen as a separate sphere of life. A state was seen as a natural institution, and then they didn't consider any they didn't make any distinction between a state and society. But politics, of course, one thing we should remember, in spite of such all encompassing and comprehensive account of politics, their definition of political activity was restrictive compared to modern times. As I mentioned, that when it came to citizens, they didn't give citizenship right to slaves, aliens, women, and they were excluded from their domain of citizenship or public affairs. For example, Aristotle's famous statement that thinking and sweating cannot go together, that those who sweat, that is laborers, those who do physical work, they cannot afford to be thinking for the affairs of state, and affairs of state always required a very sustained and engaged thinking. So therefore this is how a restrictive view of politics started, or one can say restrictive view of politics was in existence at that time. And it is here that we can say that this modern period heralded a new era, when this restrictive nature of politics was basically taken to new heights, when the expansion of this idea of political happened. Now, of course, this apart from this Greek tradition, we also have a non-Western view on this, and non-Western view in ancient time I have already mentioned the example from India, particularly Kautilya's Arthashastra, that how it is as much a treatise on politics as on administration. Mahabharata Shanti Parv, that how it is a powerful discourse on ethics, diplomacy and politics, and therefore we do not find much difference from what we see in the Greek tradition and Indian tradition, and similar examples one can pick up from other non-Western traditions as well. Now, with the birth of modern politics and expansion of political as a separate domain is something very important for us to see, particularly or see this question of politics. Now, modern period, of course, a new discourse on politics initiated, and modern period is also particularly when we say modern period, I am essentially meaning 16th and 17th century Europe, which is also the age of revolutions for European continent, particularly the birth of modernity from 16th century onward. And when I say birth of modernity, I mean number of things which happened around that time, be it scientific revolution, Renaissance, Reformation, or industrial revolution later. All these things symbolize this birth of modernity, and with these discourses, with new inventions, with new thinking, what happened that this entire understanding of politics also acquiring new meaning and new changes. And of course, with the new revolutions, new type of revolution in 20th century, which is called communist or the socialist revolution, particularly in Soviet Union in 1917, that of course added new dimension to this expansion which started in 16th and 17th century. So therefore, this advent of democracy and socialism in some countries, and also the counter tradition which developed in some of the European countries, particularly due to many factors including industrial revolution and the deteriorating conditions of the working class, when attempts were made within liberal tradition to address some of the new concerns, particularly about those people who were oppressed or who were on the margins of society. Now we find this entire understanding of politics started acquiring a new overtone, and it is here we find that expansion of political along with separation of politics from other branches of social life and activity both happened simultaneously. By 19th century, political science as a discipline took birth, and we have already discussed this issue. But at the same time, new ideologies also emerged in the same period. This was also a period of ideological birth of ideologies, and here 3-4 ideologies can be identified so far as the politics is concerned, particularly their take on politics is concerned. Liberalism, Marxism, fascism, anarchism are some of the important ideologies which can be identified here, and all of them have a different take on politics. Liberalism looks at politics altogether in different frame. Similarly, Marxism, as I alluded earlier, has a different take on politics when it talks about politics as class struggle and as a revolution. Fascism again has a altogether different reflection on politics, and anarchism as a school of thought in fact emerged and gave an important posture to these ideologies so far politics is concerned, when it took a position that authority and freedom cannot exist together, and politics the way it was imagined at that time within a state sphere and within a state domain, that anything which is happening within the state is only politics. In fact, this anarchism offered a very powerful challenge to it when it questioned the very existence of a state, and particularly for freedom, that how both are a state is antithetical to human freedom. So therefore, there are multiple imaginations coming on issue of politics. On the one hand, politics was being identified around that time only with state affairs, and this was not something new. It was earlier also in ancient tradition, but then their understanding of state and society was organic, particularly be it Plato or Aristotle. But in modern time, even if it was not organic, nonetheless it was seen through the prism of state institutions, decision making. The loci of power was basically seen only existing within the state institutions. So that was one perspective, and then there were multiple contestations. When attempt was made to take power and politics, or the idea of political was insulated from the state sphere and was taken to the domain of civil society. And here we find that Marxism is one example when it talked of class struggle, and class struggle of course happening in society, civil society, because civil society in Marxian frame is a society or is a realm of economy. So therefore this is how this thing happened. Of course within Marxism also a number of debates took place, but I do not have time to go into those debates, particularly on politics and state. Particularly the two schools, one is called instrumentalist school led by Miliband, and the relative autonomist school led by Polonjaz and Althusser. But nonetheless, the important position that Marxism as a school of thought or as an ideology took on this politics was that politics is not confined only to state institutions, state sphere. Rather, politics is also as important, as equally integrated with the societal affair, particularly civil society. Similarly, fascism, which glorified state power, had a different take, and anarchism, as I mentioned, that was totally skeptical towards this understanding of politics as power confined in state. Now, of course, with this background, we reach to a point where you can see that many contending views on politics, and three can be identified here for a more comprehensive account of what is politics. The first is the power view, second is the liberal view, and the third is the Marxist view. If these three views are important to understand what is politics, then also we have seen that two important attempts to expand this idea of political, and these two major interventions on this expansion of political are one feminist intervention and the second is the environmentalist intervention. So these two important interventions can be identified so far as the breaking of boundaries is concerned, so far as the boundary of political is concerned in modern time. And then if these are the two attempts to expand the idea of political, then in late 20th century and 21st century we also find new problematization of this idea of political, and this new problematization has happened through three major churnings and interventions in politics, and they are postmodern view, the second is the communitarian view, and the third is the neoliberal view. These are the three important churnings on this problematization, because they are coming with a new posture, they are coming with the new questions, they are bringing new challenges on the table, and therefore this entire idea of politics as well as political are today addressing these concerns and these challenges. So this is how we have to look at this both politics and political in 21st century, that how it is basically moving in this direction. Now in our next lecture we will look at initially first on these three views on politics: power view, the liberal view, and the Marxist view, and then we will see also the two important expansion of this idea of political, the feminists and the environmentalists, and then we will see the churnings, that how these churnings are happening in this entire thing, that how these churnings are happening along these lines, particularly the postmodern and communitarian and the neoliberal churnings. So I will stop here, and in the next lecture we will take up this issue, that how multiple contestations have taken place along this power, liberal and the Marxist, and the expansion and the new problematization.